All right, Saagar, what are we looking at?
We often hear a lot from the nations of Eastern Europe about the war in Ukraine. The prime ministers of the Baltic nations, as well as Finland and Sweden, are always salivating to push the US into war with Russia and to beat the war drum harder than anybody else in the NATO alliance. They want to give away the entire US store to Ukraine. But often ignored in the view of the Ukraine conflict is Hungary, which, unlike any of those states, actually shares a land border with Ukraine. And of course, also shares the long history of Soviet and Russian imperialism. The reason Hungary is ignored is because it explicitly has a different view of the Ukraine conflict than every other nation inside of NATO. These views are inconvenient, and thus you never hear about them. And no matter what you think about Hungary the nation, you still cannot be arrogant enough to dismiss the view then of a NATO member, a former victim of Russian imperialism, and a literal border state to the war in Ukraine. Tucker Carlson sat down recently with Viktor Orban, he's the leader of Hungary, for his view of the Ukraine conflict, and some parts of this are vital for everyone to hear in America. Let's take a listen to the first part.
The view is that Ukraine is winning this war. It doesn't sound like that's true.
No, it's a lie. It's not just a misunderstanding. It's a lie. It's impossible. Everybody who's in politics and understand the logic, the figures, the data, no way.
Why is it impossible?
Because that way, the poor Ukrainians die every day.
Yes.
Hundreds and thousands, So my heart is with them. So it's tragedy. It's tragedy for Ukraine. But they will run out earlier from the soldiers, number of soldiers, than the Russians. What finally will count is boots on the ground. And the Russians are far stronger, far numerous, more numerous.
There's more
than
of them.
Ukrainians.
Many more.
So this strategy, what we are just supporting, is a bad engineering of the strategy.
Okay, stark words there to start us off. The narrative that Ukraine is winning is a lie, according to Orban. Orban says that the number of troops expended by Ukraine versus Russia, and he notes that the Russian colossus's ability to endlessly throw poor conscripts into the fray. The counterpoint to this, then, is that the West must make it so that the war in Ukraine is so painful for Russia that they sue for peace or withdraw, because the population doesn't want to pay the price anymore. Here's what Orban specifically had to say about that strategy.
To understand the Russians, it's a difficult thing, especially if you have an ocean between you and Russia. So when we speak about politics, I mean Westerners, what is the focus point of our conversation? The focus point is freedom. How to provide more and more freedom to the people.
Yes.
When you speak on politics in Russia, this is not the number one issue. The number one issue, how to keep together the country, because the country is very big. And there's a privilege of the question how to keep together the country, and not freedom. Freedom is just another issue, second, third, whatever. First, keep the country together. And that's generate a different kind of culture and understanding of politics. That's create a kind of military approach, like
Yes.
they have. Always on security, safety, buffer zone, geopolitical approaches. It's not our culture, it's a different approach. It's legitimate to have that because it's their history. But we have to understand that we cannot beat them as we do just now. It's impossible. They will not kill their leader. They will never give it up. They will keep together the country and they will defend it. We finance more, they will invest more. If we send more technical equipment, they will produce more. So don't misunderstand the Russians.
So they're not going to get sick of Putin and throw him out.
Come on, it's a joke.
Come on, it's a joke. Strong words again. What is very important, though, about what Orban said is our conception of how our population or some other Western nation may respond to sanctions and death is not the Russian view at all, both at a population level and a governmental level. Perhaps his most important insight there is the preservation of Russian territory and a broader conception of a greater Russia historically is a vital national security interest to the Russian regime for all time. Thus, when something is vital, you are willing to expend significant military resources, population, and endure pain to accomplish it. That has frequently been comparison of turning Ukraine into Russia's Vietnam. First of all, that's dumb because Russia already had its Vietnam. It was called Afghanistan. But the reason why our Vietnam was Vietnam and theirs was Afghanistan was that it was arrogant military adventurism focused on territory far away from the core security interests of both regimes. The populations of the US and the USSR saw clearly that the immense cost of said wars in far-flung places was not worth any notional benefit of continuing. With Ukraine, it is a very different story. First of all, the West has basically given the Russians no option right now but capitulation. And second, it is literally next door for them. It's not far away. It is considered a core part of their sphere in their minds. And fighting and escalating there has a different cost-benefit analysis for the Russian people and the Russian regime. So what do? We have a precipice. The current plan by Washington is simple. Pour as much money into Ukraine politically and bleed the Russians dry with the hope that they eventually just fold one day. All of this is done with the Biden edict of nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. Here, too, Orban popped the thought bubble of those in Washington, D.C., making it clear the power behind this conflict is not Kyiv. It is right here in Washington. Take a listen.
First, you should admit, probably publicly acknowledging, that the key is in your hand. So if United States would like to have a peace, next morning there is a peace. Because it's obvious that the Ukrainians, the poor Ukrainians on their own, they are not competitive in this war. So if there is no money and there is no equipment from the West and especially from the United States, the war is over.
Yes.
The solution is in your hand. It's in the hand of your president. The present one or the future one. But you will solve it. The United States can do it, nobody else. It's not the solution for the Ukrainians. Of course, it's about Ukrainians. They cannot be neglected. They must be involved. But the real factor is not Ukraine. The real factor is intention of the United States.
Yes.
If our president wants peace, there will be peace. That's according to Orban. This, too, is obvious looking at a basic chart of weapons and material going to Ukraine. We contribute more than the rest of the entire world combined, including the great powers of Europe. So obviously, then we get the most say. I'm just going to end with this. I'm not claiming whatsoever Orban is the majority view within NATO or even amongst former socialist republics. Obviously, he is not. But it is vital to hear what he has to say, specifically because it allows for dissenting views and debates. Dissenting views and debates which did not happen when we lost our senses and we let every tiny nation of all of Eastern Europe into NATO without a single regard for the consequence of the future. Our current policy in Ukraine is signing us up for never-ending bills, never-ending military supply, and never-ending diplomatic problems at a time when our attention in a different region of the world has never been more important. So I was really struck by what he had to say. And listen, I get it. I know everybody hates Hungary, whatever. Okay, they're a Christian nation. Yes, they don't like immigrants, etc. Put that aside. We're not talking about that right now. We're talking about how do we see how do other NATO alliance members and people who were former socialist republics view the conflict? And where are we being honest about what the future looks like? That is probably the most stark admission that I have heard yet from an actual leader of a NATO military state and who shares a massive land border with Ukraine.
Yeah, I mean, I have no problem with Hungary. I do have some issues with Orban, but I mean, I think on this, he's being way more honest than anything I've heard from any American politician, to be totally frank with you. And, you know, the part that really disgusts me is we're effectively, because he's obviously correct that the U.S. is driving this train, that the fact that, you know, the way the war has been conducted, the, you know, continued effort to push it, the continued effort to thwart any sort of peace talks or diplomatic negotiations, that is coming from Washington. We are driving this train. That has always been really clear. And when you really think about that, you come to realize we're using the Ukrainians as pawns. And it is a devastating tragedy in that country, the number of people who are being killed and maimed and the whole nation upended and destroyed. And what is the plan? Like, what is the plan at this point? Because even the thing that's articulated of like, well, I guess we're just going to keep doing, I mean, that's keep doing this forever. Like, even that doesn't really make sense. Do we really, how does that serve our interest or anyone's interest? So the clarity of saying, yes, it's the U.S. that's driving this train. And stop with the learned helplessness, too, of pretending like, oh, Ukraine's doing these drone strikes, you know, furthest, deepest into Russian territory, and we wish they wouldn't, but what can we? Of course you can do something. Of course you are not helpless in this situation. So to hear someone, even someone that I'm not a fan of, laying out there what feels to me like some real unvarnished truths, I think is very worthwhile to listen to.
Yeah, I mean, and that's what really just comes across is where he's like, look, this is on you. He's like, you guys are the ones who do it. I also really enjoyed, there's some different moments where he goes at U.S. arrogance. He's like, oh, you guys fought the Cold War and you think you know something about Russia. He's like, why don't you ask people like us who were actually ruled by the Russians? He's like, we understand them. He was arrested actually for protesting against the Soviet regime. This isn't somebody who is pro-Russian or whatever in any aspect of the world. He's just different in terms of his view of how they should conduct themselves in the alliance. So anyway,
but you know, the other thing with that is he was explaining like, oh, you have to understand how the Russians think, but I don't think the way that they view this is so different from how we, like the sanctions, for example. You know, we had this idea that, oh, the sanctions will make life hard and they'll fold and whatever. You know, first of all, our own experience of trying to use sanctions, it has never worked out that way. But, you know, even with the Ukrainian expectation that attacks on Russian soil would also weaken their resolve, I mean, historically, it's had the exact opposite impact. If that happened to us, it would have the exact opposite impact. So I don't know that the Russian people they've been propagandized and they're invested in this, what is, an illegal, insane imperial project of Putin that I don't support whatsoever. But I'm not sure that the way that they view things is so different from how an American would view things if you put them in the same situation, the same context.
That I don't disagree at all.
Hey guys, if you enjoyed seeing us react to each other's monologues, make sure you subscribe so that you can see our reactions to every single piece of commentary.
That's right. Go to breakingpoints.com, become a premium subscriber today.